Hello viewers, Sam Stafford here, reporting from home in Ripponden in West Yorkshire. For episode 140 of 50 Shades of Planning, I recorded a conversation with a former Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, the Right Honourable the Lord Gove. Famous in political circles, infamous, some might say, in planning circles. The Parliament of 2019 to 2024 was tumultuous for everybody, but for planning specifically, it was an especially tumultuous time. There was the 2020 Planning for the Future White Paper, which Mr Gove inherited in 2021, the same year as the Chesham and Amersham by-election. 2022 brought Mr Gove's Devolution White Paper, his resignation and reappointment, the LURB, then the LURA, the rebellion against which, over top-down housing targets, precipitated the NPPF changes that was subsequently adopted in 2023. In a conversation recorded at Soho Radio Studios, Michael, I think that I can call him Michael, talked me through all of that tumult. We also talked about strategic planning, about B.I.D.E.N, about the stance on housing that the now opposition Conservative Party should take into the next election, and we talked about the merits of Big Bang planning reform versus pragmatic incrementalism. With the aim, though, of understanding the making of Michael as a minister, and as you will see, about 2/3 of the way through, I did show him Rob Cowan's brilliant Making of a Minister cartoon. I started by asking about his first interactions with the planning system. I imagine you didn't have any interaction with the planning system barely at all before becoming a constituency MP.
Yes, I did. Before becoming an MP, I would have said zero.
And I would anticipate that your interactions with the planning system as a constituency MP in Surrey were largely invitations from residents' groups to stand in a field holding a banner that says "Protect our green
correct.
Spaces."
Yes.
So that's your.
And one thing that there's no reason why you should know or recall was that my first front bench role in opposition was as shadow housing spokesman.
I was going to ask you about that. So that afforded then a broader perspective. How long were you doing that for?
A year.
And who were you shadowing?
I was shadowing Yvette Cooper. Ruth Kelly was the Shadow Secretary of State, I think. And Yvette was certainly the Shadow Housing and Planning Minister for most of that time. And the hot topic at that point was home information packs. But we did get involved in there wasn't a big debate on planning at that time, but I can mention it. One of David Cameron's briefs to me, and it was not a shadow cabinet role, it was a junior shadow ministerial role, was to move the party away from being a party of NIMBYism. Okay. Ironically.
Well, that's the journey that will. Yeah. That's the journey that will. The
yes.
arc, the narrative arc.
Yes.
The considerable churn in ministers.
Yes.
Famously. When somebody is invited to become a housing and planning minister, is that something that a typical politician will relish, or is that a poisoned chalice? How is it? How is the role perceived?
Being housing minister, in some respects, is one of the most prestigious roles outside the cabinet. It's seen as a pretty significant brief, and one of the reasons why there's been such churn in government is that it's regarded as almost adjacent to full cabinet status. And there have been a couple of occasions, for example, I think when Caroline Flint under Gordon Brown was housing minister, when they were actually in the cabinet. I think the same thing applied for a while when we had Robert Jenrick as Secretary of State, and we had as housing minister Esther McVeigh. So it is seen as prestigious, but it is also seen as a poisoned chalice. And one of my colleagues, Jeremy Quinn, now sadly no longer an MP, was asked to take on the role of Housing Minister by Rishi Sunak in the final year or so of government. He had been a Minister of State in the Cabinet Office, and he declined. And one of the reasons is not because he didn't regard it as an intellectual challenge, it's because his constituency, Horsham, is a classic home counties constituency where resistance to development, particularly resistance from Conservative-inclined voters, would have meant that Jeremy would have found himself in what he would have considered to be an invidious position.
So you mentioned Robert Jenrick. You inherited his white paper.
Yes, exactly.
2020 white paper, which I think many within the profession were sympathetic to.
Yes.
Personal view. If Elon Musk gets us to Mars and you were designing a planning system from scratch,
yes,
it may look something like that white paper, was always my view. But to move from where we are now to that was scaring horses.
Yes,
to the extent that, and I just wonder whether the popular narrative within the profession is that the Chesham and Amersham by-election spooked the horses, and then the rowing back over a period of time from that boldness and ambition can be linked to that. Is that a fair observation? Is it as simple as that? It's
not quite as simple as that, but it's true. So as a simple headline explanation, that's absolutely correct. So to trace it back a little, after the Boris Johnson's victory in the 2019 general election, one of the areas that he and his then principal advisor Dominic Cummings were very, very keen to move fast on was planning reform overall, not just in the realm of housing but infrastructure. And I agree with you. I think that the Jenrick white paper was intellectually very sensible. And I was in government at the time and also a Surrey MP. I remember when Rob came to talk to Surrey MPs overall about it, some of my colleagues were very worried, and in particular worried about the algorithm that accompanied the white paper that demonstrated what was the level of housing need that would be calculated constituency by constituency. They were quite spooked by it. I argued that actually this was both sensible, we needed to show that we were on the side of the next generation, and this was a measure that had manifesto approval. But you are absolutely right. The Chesham and Amersham by-election, Lib Dem victory there, and Lib Dem opposition, not just to HS2, but to development overall, stymied things. And that led to a backlash, and that backlash led to Rob leaving the government at that time, and also to my arriving with the white paper in effect paused.
So that was inherited. Your agenda that you owned,
yes,
is the Levelling Up white paper and subsequent bill.
Yes,
I'm very interested to know about the mechanics of making those kinds of things happen, because even amongst seasoned professionals, there is a tendency to talk about the government.
Yes,
the government does this, the government does not do this, as if it's a homogenous entity. Can you offer an insight to people who don't know, and I don't know, so I'm asking, as to how you go about preparing the ground for and then preparing itself, the white paper? Who is involved in that? Who is involved in that?
Yes.
That process? What authority do you have? Whose authority do you seek? The hurdles that you go through. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Well, it's the work of many hands, as it were. So it will be the case that the permanent civil service within a government department will respond to ministerial steers and directions. They will also have counted the ministers in and counted the ministers out as well. So they will have a repository of experience and inherited wisdom. So if you're a new minister in an area which you may be broadly unfamiliar with, you will receive from the civil servants, particularly from the Director General in charge of housing and planning, and also from the government's chief planner, an understanding and appreciation of both how the system works and your role within it, the quasi-judicial role the Secretary of State has, but also the debates surrounding the reform package that may have been stalled, as it was, when you come in. It will also be the case that number 10 will have a view. And by number 10, I don't just mean the Prime Minister. It will also be the case that there will be advisors in the policy unit who may or may not have expertise in this area and who will certainly have an interest both in delivering what the Prime Minister's policy agenda is and having some appreciation of the politics. Will this be popular? Will it play well with Conservative supporters? Will it play well in the country? In addition, it will also be the case that in any sensitive policy area, the government chief whip will have a role. Because if you're going to introduce legislation, you need to be certain that a majority of Conservative MPs, well, a majority in the House, and therefore the overwhelming majority of Conservative MPs or government MPs, will support it. Mm-hmm. And it will also be the case that other government departments, most notably the Treasury, will have a view. I think most listeners to the podcast would appreciate that the Treasury is generally in favour of growth, development and sees planning reform as part of that. And we can see that in the rhetoric that's deployed and the policies deployed by the current Chancellor and the current government. And a lot will also depend on the personality and style and approach of whoever the Secretary of State is. So to look at the situation at the moment, Angela Rayner is a strong politician with a base within the Labour Party that is loyal to her and a sense of presence and charisma, obviously by dint of being Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader, that means that she carries more weight. Again, it's always very difficult to analyse your own political position, but I think one of the advantages that I had was by dint of having been a minister in other departments before, even though I was new when I arrived at DLUC, as it was, it was still the case that most of the civil servants there would have thought, well, at least this guy knows something of how government works, so he's not a complete neophyte.
Mm-hmm. The White Paper became the bill, and then famously during its passage,
yes.
or infamously, as far as the planning profession goes,
yes,
we see the emergence of the Planning Concern
yes.
WhatsApp group, which, as I recall, was the first real test of Rishi Sunak's authority.
The Planning Concern WhatsApp group, or the concerns expressed by Conservative backbenchers about planning reform and house building overall, predated that. So it had been the case when Rob was Secretary of State that a number of people had expressed concerns, even before the Chesham Amersham by-election. The Chesham Amersham by-election gave that greater weight. Rob was then left government. I was appointed by Boris Johnson. The White Paper was brought forward, and we were seeking to push forward with the bulk, not all, but the bulk of the changes that Rob was talking about. The most important of those changes, the most transformational changes, essentially the zoning system, the creation of growth or development areas in which there wouldn't be the need to refer to a planning committee because provided it conformed to the plan, approval would be automatic. That went. That was the most difficult area overall. So the biggest prize had gone, but there was still a significant number of changes.
More difficult than the numbers, sorry to interject. More difficult than the numbers, it's the mutant algorithm.
I think they came together.
Okay.
Because the idea was that if you, you could resist the mutant algorithm. If a planning committee, a determined local authority, wanted to, even though the numbers were there, we can come on to some of the ways in which that resistance would in time and at some expense be overcome. But it was the loss of democratic control, as it were, the loss of the veto power.
The mandatory top-down target was the White Paper proposition.
Yes, and so first of all, there was some of the reforms were shorn, as it were. Then Boris fell. And obviously Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak faced off in the Tory leadership election. Conservative Party members at that point were alive to some of the concerns about planning that had been expressed by MPs and which they themselves had expressed. Many Conservative Party members were or have been councillors. And so the constituency that was choosing the next Conservative leader was one that was pretty NIMBY-ish. I don't want to, what's the word? Seek to diminish the legitimate nature of some of those concerns, and we can touch on those if you like. But certainly, the leadership election turned into, among other things, an auction in resistance to top-down targets. And both candidates pledged in slightly different ways to end them. Liz's premiership, of course, was brief. She won the leadership election. She was going to abolish targets altogether, but she was going to massively increase growth zones. How that would have worked, we don't know.
That's right, the investment zone proposition, wasn't
Exactly.
it?
Then when Rishi came in, Rishi, who's actually a very free market guy, as I think most people would acknowledge, had a particular problem, and many of his supporters had been people who'd been active in the planning concerns group of Conservative backbenchers, and they held him to it. And they said, we've got to get rid of these mandatory top-down targets. And so that led to a further erosion of the momentum for reform. And I think some people would argue that it took us back to a situation which was worse than the status quo anti-Rob's attempt to introduce planning reform, because it weakened the pressure on local authorities to meet the housing targets that the standard method produced.
And the concern within the industry at that time was that it would precipitate the collapse of plan making.
Yes.
And it precipitated the collapse of plan making.
Well, it did, and I think that one of the things that I regret is that I don't think we made clear enough to everyone that we weren't abandoning targets altogether. We were allowing for adjustment. So the political requirement to say to Conservative MPs, the nature of the target setting process has changed, and it's changed in accordance with your requests, meant that they were able to say, entirely understandably, they negotiated in good faith with us, and they were, thoughtful and sensible people. But it was presented as a win. The backbenchers have won. They've wrung a concession, and it was a concession, out of the government. And the opposition were very clear in denouncing this as a retreat, a sign of weakness on Rishi Sunak's part. There's an irony in that when Rob Jenrick's white paper was introduced, the then shadow, Steve Reed, who's a very skilled politician, denounced it as a developer's charter. So Labour had changed their position, but politics is politics. The reality, which I tried to say, is that it is still the case that the presumption in favour of sustainable growth is there. It's still the case that if you don't have a plan in place, you will find that development will go ahead on appeal anyway. So the incentive to have a plan in place is strongly there, but that message was eclipsed by the sense that, the government have said that we don't need to plan for development on the scale that we'd hitherto imagined.
How did that change the dynamic vis-à-vis what you wanted to achieve under the remainder of your tenure?
Well, what I sought to do was to ensure that in every other way possible, we would be supportive of and clear about the need for plan making and an ambitious approach towards housing numbers overall. So, again, thanks to some of the changes that had been introduced beforehand, dating as far back as the changes introduced by Greg Clark and Eric Pickles and others, house building numbers had been relatively healthy during that Parliament. And so we were going to hit the million target overall. And so I wanted to emphasise that. I also wanted to emphasise that we would be taking a proactive approach towards supporting development, particularly in towns and cities. And I made the argument for densification as an economic good, the agglomeration effects that came from that. So we were energetic in supporting civic leaders in Leeds, Manchester and elsewhere. I also outlined plans for a significant expansion of Cambridge. And again, implicit in that was the surrender of Greenbelt land in order to ensure that I think the nation's most significant outside London economic powerhouse grew in a way that was appropriate. And I also said to those local authorities where plans were not in place or where they'd been found inadequate that we would take back control, as it were, and that the department and the planning inspectorate would take over plan making. That was one of the penalties that we inflicted on Uttlesford Council. I remember there were a number of other councils. So what I was trying to do was to show that even as we'd allowed for adjustment, even as we'd said it is perfectly legitimate for you to say that the numbers that have been calculated by the standard method cannot be achieved because of environmental or other constraints. That's perfectly legitimate. What you can't do is use this as an excuse never to come forward with a plan.
The 2023 adopted version of the NPPF that followed through with those changes,
Yes,
makes that point, but doesn't then, and then went on to say, insofar as unmet need is concerned, that only by voluntary agreement would an unmet need, a shortfall, be distributed. But there's no mechanism in place to do that, which kind of leads me on towards strategic planning, its role and value.
Yes.
Because I thought it was quite notable in the white paper, which there was a lot of interesting things in the devolution white paper, but the role of planning to tie together the other disparate strands within that devolution agenda, I thought was quite notable by its absence.
Yes, I think it's you're absolutely right that it's a lacuna. Conservatives traditionally have disliked regional spatial strategies, regional government per se. And certainly, we obviously in the coalition government dismantled Labour's approach to that, and it was popular with lots of people in local government, but at a price. However, George Osborne and Greg Clark and others were great champions of mayoral combined authorities. We created mayoral combined authorities outside London with the obviously enthusiastic support of people who went on to claim those mayoral prizes, Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham, Tracy Brabin and others. And within that, you can see how Andy Burnham has used the powers at his disposal, working with local authorities in Manchester, to develop a proper approach towards spatial planning. I think that the Labour government is clearly intending to move in that direction. It may be unpopular with lots of my Conservative colleagues, but I think it is sensible to think in those terms. However, there is a counterfactual, which is the London plan. And one of the things that I also did in office was write regularly to Sadiq Khan, pointing out the failure overall of the London plan and he, as Mayor of London, to deliver anything like the housing numbers that were needed. And indeed, I think recent figures suggest that housing starts across a variety of London boroughs are, flatlining. And it's not a party political point against the Labour mayor. I think that there are other factors, as well as the planning regime, per se, the national planning regime, that inhibit development. And I think one of them in London is viability and the demand that's placed on developers for a certain percentage of social housing. I think there are aspects of the London plan as well that also add cost. And also, to be fair, one of the other things that developers also say to me is that the building safety regulator is acting as a
very hot topic,
as a bottleneck on development. Building safety matters hugely, as we all know, in the wake of Grenfell. I don't think it's a legislative matter. I think it's an administrative matter. I think it's the building safety regulator is not operating as effectively as it should in order to expedite approval.
The other element of your tenure that would come to mind amongst a conversation between planners would be B.I.D.E.N.
Oh, yes. And the last B.I.D.E.N. fan there is.
Can you, how do you reflect on beauty particularly?
Yes. Well, one of the things that I was anxious to do was to say, and we alluded to this earlier, NIMBYism isn't entirely irrational. That quite a lot of development is not experienced by the existing communities that it happens alongside as adding to the quality of their life. And that's down to a variety of things. And I came up with this corny acronym, B.I.D.E.N., to explain what the factors were. So they were in order: beauty, the aesthetic quality of new development, infrastructure, and planners will be completely familiar with this argument about whether it's infrastructure before expansion and so on, roads, GP surgeries, schools, and so on. D was democracy, and the vital sense that people were involved and consulted and had a veto ultimately. E was for environment, and that was both things like biodiversity net gain, but also the broader environmental impacts and externalities of development. And N stood for neighbourhood, which was just the sense that new development was not being bolted on, but was being integrated into existing communities. Of those, the one I think which caused the most controversy was beauty. The idea that the government should somehow dictate the aesthetic style of development. I didn't see it as my place to dictate the aesthetic style, though I would have used and did use call-in powers at certain points if proposed developments did not meet what the local plan or other provisions required in terms of aesthetics. But what I wanted to do was to raise the game overall of development and house building in this country, because I do believe, and measures of public opinion do reinforce this, that the quality of new development is a factor in the willingness of people to accept it. And the one example I cited, which may or may not have been a wise one, was Poundbury. Not everyone agrees with the King's taste in architecture. I love it, but not everyone does. However, even if you think that it is pastiche and retro and shishi and derivative and so on, it's a fact that houses in Poundbury sell for more than houses in Dorchester, the community to which it's a suburb or augmentation or an extension. That's very rare anywhere else. It's very rare that properties in the urban extension end up selling square metre for square metre more than the original dwelling or neighbourhood. So my argument was the market rewards those who invest in quality, and part of quality is aesthetics. And there were a number of other developments, some, of course, put forward by the King, but some put forward by other enlightened landowners, which I believed encapsulated that. But I do acknowledge that for a number of developers, there were sort of two things. One is beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and the other is, look, this is another cost. You say you want to extend home ownership. You're asking us to pay for building safety. You're asking us to pay for biodiversity loss through the BNG system. And now you're also saying that our pattern book has to be approved by your new Quango, the Office for Place, before we can go ahead. This is all just adding to the cost the consumer will have to bear.
Mm-hmm. I sense I don't. Good design doesn't cost.
No,
I think that's a fundamental point. I always just sense that beauty was something of a straw man, or could be held as such.
Yes.
Never quite beautiful enough to actually.
No, I think that's fair. Yes, I mean you can easily see how it can be used as yet another reason to say no. And since other criteria are measurable, you can work out what the financial cost of biodiversity net gain might be, and you can work out or negotiate through a Section 106 agreement. But ultimately, if someone in authority says it's just not beautiful enough, how do you win that argument? My point was that it should be democratically determined through design codes, and the Office for Place was something that we set up with the support of a man I very much admire, Nick Boy-Smith, who's very pro-development, runs an organisation, Create Streets, which is there to support development, in order to help both developers and local authorities. And I think the current government removed references to beauty in the NPPF, and I think they did so because, as you quite rightly point out, a number of developers would have said, look, this is impossible to define and could end up being a unnecessary barrier to achieving development. But it has been the case that the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and others have made reference to Georgian-style terraces. They have worked with people from Create Streets. And it is striking that the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister have visited the King's Own developments, Nance Leaden in near Newquay in Cornwall, in order to associate themselves with that. So even if my introduction, originally it was great James Brokenshaw's introduction, of beauty into the debate about planning may not have been as adept as it might have been, it's undeniably the case that the aesthetic quality of development is something around which there is a sort of political curiosity and consensus.
I'm going to share with you one of my...
Yes! The Ascent of the Planning Minister. Yes.
You've seen that before?
I haven't seen it before. But I think that I think it's probably true of lots of ministers that you arrive with a set of, if not primitive or Paleolithic, certainly simple views about your area. And then ministers evolve and they develop an appreciation of it. And I think, there were some people who, as you say, will arrive and think planning is the enemy of enterprise. And I think that, funnily enough, we touched briefly on Liz Truss's time as Premier. And I think Liz and people who support her would have tended to take that view. They would have said that housing targets are a function of a system which is essentially Stalinist. Mm-hmm. And what we need to do is to sweep away constraints and controls, get rid of the Town and Country Planning Act, aptly nationalised land and planning consent, and that's a mistake. We should have a free-for-all. I think that's naive and unsustainable in a country like Britain. The correct thing to do, and it is a very sort of British compromise, is to use the planning system and the expertise of planners to reconcile what will be different interests, the interests of existing communities in maintaining amenity, and the broader national interest and the interest of the next generation in having somewhere to live and new infrastructure. One of the problems, however, that we have, which I think has been well advertised, is that the planning system is a bit like the school curriculum, which I know about from my time as an education minister, which is that lots of people who don't know much about it try to add things to it because they know that that's a means of achieving their end. Mm-hmm. So you will have people, very enlightened people, who want to tackle CO2 emissions on our roads, and they will regard the planning system and the restrictions on parking spaces as a means of doing that. And it's just another additional factor in the huge planning equation that just makes everything more complicated.
So, drawing all of that together, I showed my face at a Conservative YIMBY thing.
Oh yes,
the other evening with
Simon Clarke and Penny Morden.
Yeah, that came only a few days after the local elections and the reform quake and the temptation, the inevitable temptation one imagines looking ahead to the next general election to follow votes in that kind of direction. Based on your reflections and experience, I mean, what David Cameron asked you to build, consent locally for development, and what if people don't? What if people don't want it? I mean, I guess what would be your reflections for somebody in the Conservative Party looking ahead to the next general election about where that bullishness for new homes meets? You see what I'm getting at?
No, completely. No, I absolutely do. So, nothing in politics is easy, and the most difficult job of all is being leader of the opposition. So I have to be careful in the advice that I would give because, I was on deck, arguably very near to the captain as the Titanic sank in 2024. So as first mate on the Titanic, I shouldn't really be giving people navigation advice. But since you tempt me, I would say the Conservative Party has to be a party of home ownership and aspiration. And if those are to be more than just vague, abstract commitments, then I think the Conservative Party has to be in favour of house building and development. There can be caveats, and there can be ways of taking account of the aesthetic, environmental, and other concerns that I've mentioned. But I think that for the opposition, I wouldn't make a fetish out of opposing the government's own changes to planning. I don't think the current government's changes to planning are quite as radical as they seek to maintain, but they're generally, as far as I can see, all steps in the right direction.
I would concur, and you anticipated my final point insofar as the politics of opposition, the politics of government. Again, based on your experience, well, you've just said, is it bold enough? If you're going to get to 300,000 homes a year, is a big bang set piece interventionist approach, of the type of the white paper? Is that worth the political pain? Is there a window of opportunity relative to oiling the wheels? The planning system gets layered on and layered on, and actually, again, in a roundabout kind of way, bold, transformative, controversial versus incremental, pragmatic.
Yes, so I think there's a difference between opposition, where you need to make a bit of noise to cut through, and government. And I think your second choice is actually probably a shrewd one. When I was appointed, my friend Nick Bowles, who had been planning minister before, who's a radical, now very supportive of Labour, partly because of that, said to me that actually there would probably be more gains in government, given that I was appointed halfway through the Parliament, in making the existing system just work better. Now, that is easier said than done. But everything from making sure that local planning departments are properly resourced, making sure that the planning inspectorate is properly resourced. I suspect your listeners will know, but not many people will, that one of the problems with the planning inspectorate is that the Government Property Service has placed the planning inspectorate in a building in Bristol in which there are insufficient desks for the number of people whom you actually have working there. So it's not the case that people are working from home as a result of idleness. It's a part of poor planning on the part of the government. But that is just one example of the matrix of things that should be addressed. The other thing, which I think, to be fair, the government has talked about, is the use of some tools that already exist, from compulsory purchase powers through to special development orders, to do some quite daring things. So in the establishment of new towns or garden villages, and also in Oxford and Cambridge, in particularly ambitious development there. The times in the past when England has managed to build more than 300,000 homes have involved quite extensive state intervention, whether that is the creation of development corporations in new towns or a significant social housing programme. The latter would be costly, but I do think it is the case, and I'm sure the government will be thinking about this, that some quite audacious place-specific moves could move the dial.
Mm-hmm. Just finally, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
You've been afforded a peerage.
Yes.
Which affords you the opportunity to kick the tyres of government legislation from the Lords. Is that? I mean, how do you? What of your many roles are you most interested in, and how do you propose to use that ability to kick the tyres in the planning space, if at all? It's
difficult because I enjoyed all of the government jobs that I had, apart from being chief whip, which I wasn't very good at.
Too nice.
I don't know. Just wasn't very good at it. So, I mean, people have said I was useless in all my jobs, but that was the one I definitely think I wasn't great at. So, I'm interested in education and justice, and the environment and planning. As it happens, the interface between each is one of the things I'm most interested in. So when I talk about the interface between education and justice, one of the things I'm most interested in are is the fate and the destiny of those children in the care system, or who are persistently absent, or who find themselves excluded from school, a forgotten, sadly neglected group of young people who deserve far more care, attention, and policy focus. And then the interface between environmental enhancement and delivering the infrastructure that we need. That is an area which particularly interests me. And there's been a lot of interesting thinking in that area from people on the centre-right, a recent Foundations report by Ben Southwood, Samuel Hughes and others. So I'll try to play my part. And the other thing is that I'll try to be, as I hope I've been in our conversation, capable of being fair-minded, because there will be some things, as I've indicated, that the government are doing in this area, which I think people who are not natural Labour supporters should applaud. And I hope that the House of Lords is the sort of place where that won't be too infra-dig.
Whether you agree with the decisions that he took and the agendas that he pursued, the one thing upon which I am sure that there would be cross-sector consensus is that Michael Gove's stewardship of the planning system was a memorable one. I am most grateful to him for taking the time to record that with me. I am sure that you will have enjoyed and appreciated his insight and his candour. Michael mentioned a Foundations report by Ben Southwood and Samuel Hughes, and also Sam Bowman. You will find a link to that in the description of this episode. And just for posterity, and I suppose a reminder of just how tumultuous a time it was, I have included a couple of blogs that I wrote on the December 2022 and December 2023 versions of the NPPF. Please do keep in mind, viewers, that 50 Shades of Planning is by planners and for planners, and so if you would like to use this platform for sharing anything you think that we need to be talking about, then do please feel free to get in touch with me via samstafford@hotmail.com. My thanks to Adrian Meehan at Soho Radio Studios for recording this episode, and to Rachel Cooper at Viral Tribe for editing it. What have we learnt? Well, as regular viewers will know, town and country planning is very much not a black and white endeavour. There are at least 50 shades in between. Thanks to you for watching all the way to the very end. I am much obliged. There will be another episode along soon. But bye for now.